The morning mist clung to the marble headstones like whispered secrets refusing to leave. Frank Morrison pulled his worn jacket tighter as he walked the familiar path through Arlington National Cemetery, his German Shepherd Rex padding silently beside him. At 72, Frank had made this journey countless times since retiring from his job at the hardware store. Always on the anniversary of battles he'd rather forget. Rex, a former military working dog himself, had been Frank's companion for 3 years now, ever since the VA paired them through their service dog program. The dog's dark eyes held the same weight that Frank recognized in his own reflection. The burden of having seen too much, survived too much. This Veterans Day felt different though, heavier somehow, as if the very air carried the weight of unfinished business. Frank had planned their usual route past the tom of the unknown soldier. But Rex had other ideas, his ears pricked forward with an alertness that made Frank's old instincts kick in. Rex suddenly stopped mid-stride, his entire body going rigid. As they passed Section 60, where the newer graves held the remains of soldiers from recent conflicts, the dog's nose twitched, catching something Frank couldn't detect. And then came the sound that made Frank's blood run cold. Rex wasn't barking or whining, he was crying. Deep guttural sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his canine soul. Frank had never heard anything like it in all his years around military dogs. The shepherd's massive frame shook as he sat down heavily in front of a simple white headstone, his brown eyes fixed on the engraved name with an intensity that made Frank's hands tremble. Other visitors began to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the haunting sound of the dog's grief. Frank knelt beside Rex, his arthritic knees protesting against the cold ground, and placed a weathered hand on the dog's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the thick fur. Something was terribly wrong, or perhaps terribly right. The headstone was modest, like so many others in this sacred ground, bearing the name Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, age 24, killed in action in Afghanistan 3 years prior. Frank didn't recognize the name, but Rex's behavior suggested a connection that defied explanation. The dog's crying had softened to a low whimper, but his gaze never left the grave marker. Frank noticed other details now, the way Rex's tail remained perfectly still, not the usual subtle wag he maintained during their walks, and how his breathing had changed to quick, shallow pants despite the cool morning air. A small cluster of silk flowers lay wilted against the stone, their colors faded by weather and time. Frank checked his phone, realizing they'd been standing here for nearly 20 minutes, long enough for a small crowd of curious visitors to form a semicircle around them. An elderly woman in a navy peacoat stepped forward, her silver hair catching the morning light as she approached with careful, measured steps. Her eyes were kind but carried the unmistakable shadow of loss that Frank knew all too well. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been watching your dog, and I think I might know why he's reacting this way." She introduced herself as Dorothy Chen, Michael's grandmother, and Frank felt his chest tighten with understanding. Dorothy explained that she visited Michael's grave every few months, traveling from her home in Baltimore, and that Michael had written extensively about his military working dog partner in his letters home. The dog's name had been Rex, a German Shepherd who'd served alongside Michael for 2 tours before being injured in the same explosion that claimed Michael's life. According to the official reports, Rex had died from his injuries, but Dorothy had always harbored doubts about the story. She'd tried to get more information through proper channels, but the bureaucracy had stonewalled her efforts, leaving her with nothing but questions and a grandson's letters filled with love for his 4-legged battle buddy. Frank's mind raced as he processed this information, looking down at Rex, who continued to whimper softly at the grave. The impossible was staring him in the face, and every instinct honed by decades of military service told him to trust what he was seeing. Frank's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through the documentation the VI had provided when Rex was assigned to him. The paperwork listed Rex as a 7-year-old German Shepherd, previously unnamed, rescued from a military contractor's facility where had been held for medical treatment following combat injuries. The dates aligned perfectly with Michael Chen's death, and Frank felt his breath catch in his throat as he realized the magnitude of what they'd stumbled upon. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she knelt beside the dog, extending her hand slowly toward Rex's scarred muzzle. The moment her fingers touched his fur, Rex whimpering stopped, replaced by the softest tail wag Frank had ever witnessed. It was as if some invisible circuit had been completed, connecting the grieving grandmother to her grandson's lost companion through a bond that transcended bureaucracy and time. Frank explained Rex's situation, how had been assigned as a PTSD service dog with no mention of his previous military service or his connection to Michael Chen. The cover-up was becoming clear, a deliberate attempt to hide what must have been a painful administrative failure during Rex's recovery. Dorothy reached into her purse with trembling fingers, withdrawing a worn envelope that she had carried with her for 3 years. "This is Michael's last letter," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "He wrote it the day before the attack, and it's all about Rex. He was planning to adopt him after their deployment ended, had already started the paperwork to bring him home." She unfolded the letter carefully, the paper soft with handling, and Frank could see Michael's neat handwriting covering both sides of the stationery. The letter painted a picture of an unbreakable bond between soldier and dog, describing Rex's incredible instincts, his gentle nature with children during village patrols, and his uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived. Michael had written about his dreams of Rex meeting his family, of long walks in Baltimore's parks, of giving his battle buddy the peaceful retirement he deserved. Frank listened as Dorothy read excerpts aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word, as if channeling her grandson's spirit through his written words. Rex remained perfectly still during the reading, his intelligent eyes moving between Dorothy and Frank, as if he understood every word. The letter revealed more than just a soldier's love for his dog. Michael had documented concerns about their unit's intelligence reports, discrepancies that had noticed in patrol patterns, and local informant information. Had written about suspicious activities had observed, suggesting that someone within their support structure might be feeding information to hostile forces. The explosion that killed Michael, and supposedly killed Rex, had occurred during what should have been a routine patrol, but Michael's letter indicated had grown increasingly wary of their local guides and interpreters. Frank recognized the signs of a soldier who'd sensed betrayal but hadn't been able to prove it before it was too late. Dorothy explained that she'd shared these concerns with military investigators, but they'd dismissed them as the paranoid musings of a combat-stressed soldier. The official report blamed the attack on random insurgent activity, case closed, file buried. But Rex's survival suggested that the official story might be as fabricated as his supposed death, and Frank felt the familiar weight of military cover-up settling over the situation like a familiar, unwelcome coat. Frank made a decision that surprised even himself. "Dorothy, I think we need to get some answers, and I think Rex knows more than any of us realize." He stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and looked down at the dog who had become the center of an unfolding mystery. Rex met his gaze with those intelligent brown eyes, and Frank saw something there had never noticed before, a deeper awareness that suggested memories rather than just trained responses. Dorothy agreed immediately, her grandmother's instincts aligned with Frank's military experience in recognizing that they'd stumbled onto something significant. They exchange contact information, planning to meet the following day at Dorothy's hotel to organize their investigation. Frank suggested they start by contacting Michael's former unit members, if any had survived, and try to piece together the real story of what happened during that fatal patrol. He also knew a few retired officers who specialized in helping veterans navigate military bureaucracy, people who might be able to access records that had been classified or misfiled. Rex seemed to approve of their plan, his tail wagging more enthusiastically as they prepared to leave the cemetery. As they walked back toward the parking area, Frank noticed how Rex's demeanor had completely changed. The dog's step was lighter, his head held higher, and there was an alertness in his movement that spoke of purpose rather than routine. Frank realized that for the first time since they'd been paired together, Rex was truly engaged with the world around him, rather than simply performing his duties as a service dog. Dorothy walked beside them, clutching Michael's letter to her chest, and Frank could see hope beginning to replace the resigned grief that had marked her earlier expressions. She talked about Michael's childhood, his decision to enlist, and her pride in his service, painting a picture of a young man who'd inherited his grandmother's determination and sense of justice. Frank found himself sharing stories of his own service, experiences had rarely discussed with anyone, finding common ground with this elderly woman who'd become an unexpected ally in seeking truth. Rex listened to their conversation with the focused attention of a soldier receiving a briefing, and Frank began to wonder just how much the dog actually understood about their mission. The next morning found them gathered in Dorothy's hotel room, a modest space she'd converted into a makeshift command center with Michael's letters spread across the desk and her laptop open to military database searches. Frank had arrived with a folder of documents had requested from the VA, and Rex had positioned himself strategically where he could observe both the door and the window, his service dog training blending seamlessly with older, deeper instincts. Dorothy had been busy since their meeting, reaching out through social media and veteran networks to locate members of Michael's unit. She'd found 2 survivors, both of whom had expressed surprise and concern when she mentioned Rex's supposed death. According to their accounts, Rex had been evacuated alive but severely injured, and they'd been told he was being sent to a specialized treatment facility in Germany. The fact that had ended up in a contractor's facility with no record of his previous service suggested a deliberate effort to erase his identity and connection to the incident. Frank examined the discrepancies in the official timeline, noting gaps that could easily conceal a cover-up designed to protect someone's reputation or career. Dorothy's research had uncovered another troubling detail. The interpreter who'd guided Michael's patrol that day had disappeared shortly after the attack, his whereabouts unknown, and his employment records mysteriously incomplete. Michael's surviving squad mates remembered him expressing concerns about this particular interpreter, suspicions that were documented in Michael's letters but apparently ignored by his commanding officers. Frank's contacts in the military network had provided additional context, explaining that contractor fraud and intelligence leaks had been significant problems during that period of the conflict, with several high-profile cases resulting in American casualties. The pattern suggested that Michael had stumbled onto something much larger than a simple security breach, possibly a systematic betrayal that had cost multiple lives and been covered up to avoid embarrassment at higher levels of command. Rex's survival and subsequent concealment might have been necessary to prevent his potential testimony from exposing the conspiracy. Dogs like Rex were trained to recognize specific individuals, and his reactions could have provided evidence of the interpreter's involvement that human witnesses might not have been able to offer. The breakthrough came when Dorothy discovered a phone number for Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, Michael's former commanding officer, who had retired and was now working as a consultant in Washington, D.C. Patterson agreed to meet with them, his voice carrying the wariness of a man who'd been waiting for this conversation for 3 years. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near the Pentagon, neutral ground where Patterson could speak freely without the constraints of active duty protocols. Frank could sense Rex's excitement as they prepared for the meeting, the dog's behavior suggesting he remembered Patterson and anticipated some form of resolution. Dorothy brought copies of Michael's letters and the documentation they'd gathered, while Frank prepared questions based on his own experience with military investigations. The drive to Washington was tense with anticipation, Rex alert in the back seat, as if he understood the significance of their destination. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson was waiting for them when they arrived, a tall man in his 50s whose civilian clothes couldn't quite disguise his military bearing. His face showed the strain of carrying secrets, and Frank recognized the look of an officer who'd been forced to make impossible choices. Rex's reaction to Patterson was immediate and intense, not the aggressive alertness had shown at the cemetery, but a complex mix of recognition, loyalty, and something that looked like forgiveness. Patterson knelt to greet Rex, his hands gentle as he examined the scars that marked the dog's recovery, and Frank saw tears in the older man's eyes as he whispered apologies that seemed to carry the weight of command decisions made under impossible circumstances. Dorothy sat quietly, letting the reunion unfold naturally, understanding that this moment represented a healing that transcended her own need for answers. Frank observed the interaction with the analytical eye of a fellow veteran, recognizing the signs of shared trauma being acknowledged and perhaps finally addressed. The cafe was nearly empty, providing them with the privacy they needed for conversations that had been 3 years in the making. Patterson's story unfolded slowly, each detail adding layers to the conspiracy that had cost Michael his life and nearly claimed Rex as well. The interpreter, whose real name was Ahmed Rashid, had been feeding information to insurgent forces for months, but proving his betrayal required evidence that could hold up in military court. Michael had been building a case, documenting suspicious patterns, and gathering witness statements from local villagers who'd grown to trust the young soldier and his dog. Rex had been crucial to this investigation, his ability to detect fear and deception, making him an invaluable partner in identifying compromised individuals within their local network. The explosion that killed Michael had been specifically targeted to eliminate him before he could complete his report, and Rex's injuries had been severe enough that he was initially expected to die. Patterson had made the difficult decision to conceal Rex's survival, knowing that if the dog recovered, he might become a target for elimination by the same forces that had killed Michael. The cover-up had been designed to protect Rex, not to hide incompetence or corruption, but Patterson acknowledged that the deception had caused additional pain for Michael's family and prevented proper recognition of the soldier's final service. The interpreter had vanished immediately after the attack, confirming suspicions about his involvement. But by then the damage was done and the investigation was closed to prevent further casualties. Patterson explained that he'd tried to find a way to reunite Rex with Michael's family once the dog recovered, but the bureaucratic maze of contractors and medical facilities had made tracking him nearly impossible. When Rex disappeared from the treatment facility, Patterson had assumed the worst, that the dog had died from complications or been euthanized due to his injuries. Learning that Rex had survived and been placed with another veteran brought both relief and renewed guilt, as Patterson realized that his well-intentioned deception had separated the dog from the family he was meant to protect. Dorothy listened to this explanation with a mixture of anger and understanding, her grandmother's heart torn between fury at the injustice and gratitude that both Rex and Patterson had survived their ordeal. Frank found himself respecting Patterson's impossible position, recognizing the kind of command decisions that haunted officers long after they'd left the battlefield. Patterson reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder that had carried to every job interview and business meeting for 3 years, waiting for this moment. "This is Michael's complete investigation file," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets finally being shared. Everything he documented about the intelligence leaks, the compromised operations, and Ahmed Rashid's betrayal. The file contained photographs, interview notes, patrol reports, and a detailed analysis of how information was being passed to insurgent forces through a network of corrupted interpreters and local officials. Michael's work had been thorough and professional, building a case that would have exposed not just Ahmed Rashid, but an entire cell of collaborators operating within the American support structure. Frank reviewed the documents with the eye of someone who understood military intelligence, recognizing the quality of Michael's investigation and the significance of what had uncovered. Rex remained calm but alert during this revelation, as if he too understood that justice was finally within reach. Dorothy studied photographs of Ahmed Rashid, memorizing the face of the man who'd betrayed her grandson's trust and ultimately caused his death. The file included evidence of at least 6 other attacks that could be traced to information provided by Rashid's network, representing dozens of American casualties that might have been prevented if the investigation had been completed. Patterson explained that had tried to pursue the case through unofficial channels after Michael's death, but the war was winding down and there was little appetite for investigations that might embarrass important allies or reveal systemic failures in intelligence gathering. The decision to classify the case and bury the investigation had come from higher up the chain of command, leaving Patterson with no choice but to carry the burden alone. Frank understood the politics involved, having witnessed similar cover-ups during his own service, but the human cost of such decisions never became easier to accept. Rex's presence served as a living reminder of the price paid for these bureaucratic expedients, and Frank could see that Patterson drew some comfort from the Dodds' forgiveness. The meeting concluded with Patterson providing them with contact information for a military attorney who specialized in posthumous investigations and cases involving intelligence failures. He also gave Dorothy the personal effects that Michael had left in his temporary quarters, items that had been held in storage for 3 years while bureaucrats decided what to do with them. Among these possessions was a small photo album containing pictures of Rex during their deployment, images that showed the deep bond between soldier and dog in moments of both tension and quiet companionship. Dorothy clutched the album to her chest, tears streaming down her face, as she finally held tangible evidence of her grandson's love for his 4-legged partner. Frank watched this emotional reunion with the satisfaction of a mission completed, understanding that while they couldn't bring Michael back, they'd managed to restore his memory and honor his final investigation. Rex seemed to sense the significance of the moment, pressing close to Dorothy's legs in a gesture of comfort that transcended his service training. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Patterson made one final request. He asked if he could visit Michael's grave with them, to pay respects that had been impossible, while maintaining the secrecy of his investigation. Dorothy agreed immediately, understanding that Patterson's guilt had been as heavy a burden as her own grief, and that both needed to be addressed at the place where Michael rested. The drive back to Arlington was quiet, each of them processing the weight of revelations that had transformed their understanding of Michael's death from random tragedy to meaningful sacrifice. Rex dozed in the back seat, the tension finally leaving his body now that the secrets had been revealed and justice seemed possible. Frank reflected on the strange path that had led them to this moment, marveling at how Rex's instinctive grief had unlocked a mystery that human investigators had failed to solve. The dog's loyalty had transcended death itself, bringing together the people who could finally honor Michael's memory properly. Back at Arlington, the three of them stood together at Michael's grave while Rex sat quietly beside the headstone, no longer crying but maintaining a dignified vigil that spoke of duty fulfilled. Patterson placed his own flowers beside the wilted ones they'd seen the day before, and spoke aloud the commendation that Michael should have received for his intelligence work, words that carried the weight of official recognition, even if they couldn't be recorded in any file. Dorothy read portions of Michael's letters aloud, sharing her grandson's dreams and aspirations with the men who'd served beside him, creating a memorial service that honored both the soldier and the bond had shared with his canine partner. Frank found himself thinking about the nature of loyalty, how it could survive bureaucracy, politics, and even death itself when embodied in creatures like Rex, who understood faithfulness at a level deeper than human complexity. The ceremony was simple but profound, acknowledging truths that had been hidden and promises that were finally being kept. The legal process that followed took several months, but the attorney Patterson had recommended proved both competent and determined. Michael's investigation was officially reopened, leading to a broader inquiry into intelligence failures during the final years of the Afghan conflict. Ahmed Rashid was eventually located and arrested by international authorities, facing charges related to his role in multiple attacks on American forces. The revelation of his betrayal network led to policy changes in how interpreters and local contractors were vetted and monitored, potentially preventing similar tragedies in future conflicts. Dorothy was invited to attend Rashid's trial, where Rex's testimony, in the form of his behavioral reactions to photographs and evidence, provided crucial support for the prosecution's case. The dog's ability to identify Rashid from photos, even after 3 years, demonstrated the depth of his memory and the trauma of betrayal had witnessed. Frank accompanied them to the courthouse, serving as Rex's handler and witness to the unique role a military working dog could play in seeking justice for fallen comrades. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Rashid was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his role in Michael's death and the other attacks his intelligence had enabled. Dorothy was finally able to grieve properly, knowing that her grandson's death had meaning and that his final investigation had ultimately succeeded in bringing his killer to justice. Rex received official recognition as a veteran and hero, with ceremonies that acknowledged both his service with Michael and his role in exposing the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. Frank found his own purpose renewed through the experience, understanding that his partnership with Rex had been about more than treating PSD symptoms. It had been about completing unfinished missions and honoring promises made to fallen comrades. The bond between veteran and service dog had revealed depths neither of them had expected, transforming them both in the process. Dorothy established a foundation in Michael's name, dedicated to supporting military working dogs and their handlers, with Rex serving as the organization's mascot and ambassador. The foundation's work focused on ensuring that the bonds between soldiers and their canine partners were recognized and protected, preventing the kind of bureaucratic failures that had nearly erased Rex from history. Frank became involved in the Foundation's activities, using his experience to help other veterans understand the healing power of working with former military dogs. Rex's story inspired legislation improving the adoption process for retired military working dogs, ensuring they could be reunited with their handlers' families when circumstances allowed. The cemetery visits continued, but now they were pilgrimages of honor rather than mystery, with Rex serving as a bridge between the living and the dead, carrying messages of love and loyalty that transcended the boundaries of mortality. As Frank reflects on their journey, he often returns to that first morning when Rex, crying, had shattered the cemetery's quiet dignity. The dog's grief had been a form of testimony, a witness statement that no human investigator could have provided, revealing truths that might otherwise have remained buried forever. Their partnership had evolved from the simple relationship between veteran and service dog into something approaching the sacred, a bond that honored both their own survival and the memory of those who hadn't made it home. Rex had taught Frank that healing sometimes required uncovering painful truths, that real peace came not from forgetting, but from ensuring that sacrifices were properly acknowledged and honored. The dog's instincts had proven more reliable than official reports, his loyalty more enduring than bureaucratic convenience. Every visit to Michael's grave now ends with the same ritual. Dorothy brings fresh flowers, Frank offers a veteran salute, and Rex sits quietly beside the headstone, his vigil no longer marked by tears, but by the dignified presence of a soldier honoring his fallen battle buddy. The cemetery staff has grown accustomed to their visits, and other veterans often stop to pay their respects to the dog whose loyalty had exposed a conspiracy and brought justice to those who died for freedom. Rex's story has become part of Arlington's living history, a reminder that honor and duty can take many forms, and that sometimes the most important truths are revealed not through official investigations, but through the unbreakable bonds forged in service to something greater than oneself. The morning mist still clings to the marble headstones, but now it carries different whispers, stories of justice served and promises kept through the determination of those who refuse to let their comrades be forgotten. Frank and Rex continue their walks through the sacred grounds, no longer searching for answers, but serving as guardians of memory, ensuring that the sacrifices represented by every headstone are properly honored and remembered. Their partnership has become a testament to the enduring power of loyalty, proving that some bonds transcend even death itself, connecting past and present through the unchanging devotion of hearts that refuse to abandon their duty to those they've sworn to protect. If you're listening to this story, please take a moment to share where you're hearing it from, and let us know about your own experiences with faithful companions who've touched your life. These stories matter because they connect us across generations and remind us of the values that define our character as a nation and as individuals who understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Our next story will reveal how another veteran's four-legged partner uncovered a decades-old mystery that changed an entire community's understanding of heroism and honor. Until then, we honor all our veterans and their families, past and present, who continue to serve our nation through their example of courage, loyalty, and unwavering dedication to the principles that make us strong. Thank you for joining us in remembering those who've given everything for our freedom.